I'd like to turn it over to Steve Buckby.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Is he here?
I think he's here. I see him. I'm looking right at him.
Good morning to you, all of you. I'm going to share my screen if that's possible. Okey doke. So thanks for inviting me. It's so much fun to be here and see so many lovely faces that I've known and the new ones I've never met. We've got a short meeting this morning to talk about my favorite subject, and I really appreciate the Satir Institute of the Pacific for a whole lots of reasons. One of them is all the work that you're doing in the world, and I really appreciate also these videos that you're sharing on the web and making it possible for more people to learn about Virginia's work. I call this a Satir model, teaching and therapy, but it's really, this is a huge idea that was offered by Virginia Satir. The idea is that all human beings are dynamic, that these parts, when we talk about mandalas, aren't static. They're always interconnecting, and we're always connected. We're always moving at some dimension. I met Virginia Satir in first time I saw her was in 1985. I was absolutely blown away. I was in Chicago at the Oasis Center run by Jane Gerber. And Virginia came in and did a 3-day workshop and absolutely blew me out of the water. She used the whole audience to work with the family, and it was profound. And at the end of it, she said, does anybody want to come and study with me? And I remember my hand going up to the point where I think I dislocated my shoulder. And I went to visit her in 1986, 3 days after I buried my father, and spent 30 days with her. And then I spent the following year trying to figure out what happened. And then 1988, I went back to the next module where she left the Hill because of illness. And that's the same year she asked me to join her training network to help teach these models. And I was pretty excited about that and still am. So I've been teaching this since 1988. She said, go home and get a triad. So I created a triad with these 3 men called Mike DuPont, Dan Doyle, and myself. And we started using these models to work in the criminal justice system, mostly with people who are working with children in non-secure, secure holding facilities. And the idea was to reduce the number of deaths in jail by offering alternatives to incarceration. And we took the process models mostly and taught them to the volunteers for about, I think we did the contract for about 25 years. And it really worked. The number of kids dying in jails dropped significantly. And so we no longer do it because the state's now moved into a different system where they're going back to holding facilities, but they're primarily for juveniles. Anyway, my motto in life is nothing so simple it can't be misunderstood. I mean, if you come from a family, you might know that. Nothing is so simple it can't be misunderstood. And I love it. Primary belief systems that Virginia had are that people are basic miracles worthy of love. And it's such a beautiful idea. Every human being is worthy of love. And the issues I find is many people believe they're not worthy of love, or they look at parts of themselves, parts of their dimensions, and say, that's who I am. And what Virginia did was allow people to see themselves in brand new ways by creating vehicles to do that. And so we're going to explore one of those vehicles. The other one is each person is a unique manifestation of life, that we are life energy. There is no one like anybody. That I'm an identical twin. When, the hardest part for a twin is not correcting the other one because they're doing it wrong. All twins have conflict. All families have conflict. And when people begin to realize that other people are unique, they allow other people to be who they are rather than who we think they should be. Virginia also said that change is possible. And I absolutely believe this. Working in a jail for a long period of time and working in an inpatient substance abuse unit, I have seen more people do some amazing things. One of the most amazing things is find out again that they mattered, and to allow themselves to forgive themselves People are mistake makers. And when we learn to forgive our mistakes, the better off we are. Another thing. Virginia's genius for me was her simplicity. She taught in a way what people could understand. She made models so people could understand them. And then she could take you very deep with them. And the last item I want to say is that change is constant, that it's the process of change. We're always in the process of change. We can't hold time, but we can change with time. And that's inevitable. All right, so now I have to, okay. Some of the basic ideas are, the idea of the mandala came from a Satir conversation with Margaret Mead. At least that's what she told me in 1986. I was sitting in the back of the fire hall when she was giving this lecture, and I was so excited by the concept that I thought, and still do believe, that it's one of the cornerstone ideas, that she and Margaret Mead were talking about the idea of universals. And in the early 70s and 60s, people did not believe that there was such a thing as a universal, something found in every culture. And Virginia said, absolutely. So they got into the idea of universals, and Margaret Mead mentioned the idea that there are mandalas in the world, that people create physical representations, and those representations are found in almost every culture. And these mandalas are really often conversations symbolically of how people believe and connect with the universe. So Virginia was an amalgamator. She would take an idea and blend it and fix it and move it into a concept so she could teach it. And so she grabbed this mandala and started using it as a tool. Mandalas, it says, are powerful symbols to help people in other cultures talk about what is known and unknown. And Satir was a way to talk about what we share in respecting the idea that all people are sacred. At the top of this slide, there's a hot link. And so if you want a copy of this PowerPoint, just email me and I'll send it to you and you can use it or have it or whatever you want to do with it. Is that okay? All right. Starts with a circle. There's an inside and the outside. There's the inside of you and there's the outside of you. Both of them are connected by the boundaries. We have the known inside and we have the unknown inside. We're constantly in a state of discovering selves. And on the outside, there are many unknowns. We're always in the constant. If you think about what's happening in the world today, the process of change is inevitable. It's always happening. In that context, the outside is always changing. So we, as a result of that, have to adjust how we're doing on the inside, if that makes sense. Belly buttons. Everybody has one. And those that don't, it's a shame. Most people have a belly button. It's how we connect to the world. Virginia used the circle often as in the mandala as the symbolic of a belly button, the idea that each person has a belly button, that we all started in the same way. That was a seed and egg model, that there's a conception and then there's a birth and then there we are, and we're born into the context that we're in. So I put this little link here too. It's a lovely little article about biodiversity and belly buttons. She also said, I never have to ask myself when I go anywhere in the world, am I going to find something generic I've never found before? No. But I am going to find all kinds of variations and I'll always know the core. This is when she starts talking about the mandala. This is the idea that when you talk about the mandala, no matter where you go in the world, and I've talked about this in many countries, lots of different places, people get it because these are pretty universal parts. Yeah, okay. The first picture I saw looked like this. And the picture was of a flower in the ground. And around that flower, there were 8 petals. And those petals, she represented the dimensions of who we are. So the dimensions were the senses or the context, nutrition, intellect, physical, the being, the container, emotions, our ability to interact with ourselves and others. And at the core of it all was a spiritual piece. If you notice the flower, it's rooted in the ground, but at the same time, it's connected to the universe. That's how she drew that. And I thought to myself, what a brilliant, simple, wonderful idea of how to teach the fact that we all have our own space and time. That no other flowers may exist, but they also operate in their own context. So this was the first time I saw it. And I remember being so excited that I thought, this is great. I have to try to learn more about this. So I spent the last 30 years, last 35 years teaching about this. I don't know how to get rid of these people. I can see. So anyway, let me, I use as a guide to help people look at system of rules, and we'll talk about that. But when you start thinking about these dimensions today, I'd like you to think about the fact that in every family system and every culture, people have different ways of interpreting and seeing these dimensions. And so how you learned in your house may be certainly different than somebody else. How you experience it may be totally different. It's also about teaching about vulnerability and trust, because when we are human beings connected to other people, what we have to do is share parts of ourselves. Vulnerability means the ability to be open to other people, be able to share. And I'm going to tell you very clearly that when we look at these dimensions, there are dimensions of ourselves sometimes that we look at and we don't like them. So Virginia would say then, what do you need to do? What changes do you want to see? What do you need to make those changes? I thought it was brilliant. So these dimensions, the first dimension that I wrote down is the spiritual dimension. Now the picture you're looking at those are not little stars, those are all galaxies actually. We are connected to the universe. We are the stuff of stars. And when you talk about the spirituality, when you look at the original drawings of Virginia Satir, at the basis of the Satir process model, when she drew it back in the late 70s, when she drew the mandala, the basis of the mandala was the spiritual part, and all the other parts laid on top of that. So this is about life energy. This is about the idea that you're connected to the infinite, that your energy that cannot be destroyed, you can only be transformed. It's a process. And so when Virginia talked about, she talked about life energy. And she talked about how do you take care of that? How do you nurture it? I'm going to whip through these parts. The second part was that we talked about is the intellectual part, the ability to take in information and learn, adapt, reorganize, the ability to question issues, the ability, and this is really crucial, but it doesn't define who we are. But when I talk about intellectual, I also mean there are lots of ways of perceiving the world, and everybody perceives it in a different fashion. When I talk about intellectual, some people think it means being smart, and it can, but it's more than that. It's more than that. It's about our ability to adapt and learn and change. And I always found it's a pretty interesting idea that this idea, sometimes, by the way, people get confused about intellect because they measure themselves again by what they can't do, but instead of what they can do. Somebody asked me what was the most terrifying book you've ever read, and I think the joke I read recently answered that, and it's algebra. Okay, joke. Okay. The next piece is the sensual piece, and this is the ability to take information in at the senses. And we'll talk about this in a second, but we know you have at least 5 senses, probably 60, right? You have, and everything that you sense, you have to make meaning about. Everything. What you see, what you hear, what you touch, what you taste, what you smell. You make meaning about everything, and that hooks directly to our iceberg. When you look at the iceberg and you look at the mandala, you look at the sensual piece, goes right into that perceptions piece, and then it goes to that, and that hooks up to the physical piece, and from that it goes to the feelings piece. So everything that we perceive in the world, we have to make meaning about. And it's pretty powerful. The next piece is the nutritional piece, and that's our ability to feed ourselves. And it's not just about food. I mean, obviously you need to have food, but you also have to feed every dimension. You have to feed your head. You have to feed your heart. You have to be nurturing. You have to be able to interact with people. You have to have a nurturing context. You have to exercise. You have to take care of yourself in that way. You have to find emotional connections. You have to find spiritual connections. And I would believe, frankly, that some people are starving nutritionally at the spiritual level. I believe that some people are definitely starving at the contextual level. And so when I talk about this idea of the nutrition, it's really about taking in things that nurture us. And I'm going to also say to you that when you start talking about addictions here, this is where you would find addictions, because this is the part that we use to cut off parts of ourselves to the world, or it's also the part we use to connect with the world. So it's a pretty amazing piece. But again, these are not all separate. And the reason I have things spinning around earlier on is to show that the idea that they're dynamic and always moving. The next piece is the interactional piece, and that's our ability to connect with ourselves and others. And again, there are all kinds of rules in our world about how we do this, what language is okay, how we talk, what spaces we use between each other, what methods we use to make contact. And I know that at some level, we're always talking to ourselves, and but we have the ability also to censor that piece and decide what we will put out into the world and what we won't put out in the world. And when you talk about this interactional piece, you got to understand that every dimension has rules about what is okay to talk about and what is not okay to talk about. That this interactional piece is really, in fact, very powerful, because in our family, we learn early rules about you can't say that, you can't talk about that, it'll upset your father, it'll upset your mother, don't talk about your father's alcoholism, don't talk about whatever. And so what we find is that this interactional piece oftentimes becomes very oppressed. And what we do as therapists often is allow people to begin to talk about the things that they were never able to talk about, to share information about themselves or even inside, and allow thoughts that maybe oftentimes were not allowed. And I know I'm moving fast, but that's sometimes the way it goes. The next piece is the contextual piece. It's where you are in space and time. You have an internal context and an external context. Context is a place, but there's an internal place. It's home. People talk about being in situations that are scary sometimes, and we say to them, what you need to do is take a breath, center yourself, get grounded. That's all context. Context, when you walk into a new place, oftentimes a new country, new town, new house. Remember when you were a child and you walked into somebody's house for the first time, it was different than your own, and you wondered, is this normal? When you walked into a house and they didn't do things in exactly the same way because they had different rules throughout each dimension, that's all context. The next piece that I have is the physical context, the container. This is the thing that I call by my name. It's, again, I have an inside and an outside. Some people believe that this is the only part of themselves that they have, that this is it. It's very important in many, many ways to pay attention that how people dress themselves, design themselves, tattoo themselves. Everything that we do to ourselves as creatures has a meaning, and it needs to be paid attention to and not ridiculed. I don't know about you, but my body sends me complex messages all the time. It's working. It tells me that I'm tense, or right now my hands are a little cold, and it's saying, relax, Steve, slow down. You're a little nervous. But bodies are always sending us messages. And it's important that we pay attention to them. But I'm really thinking sometimes that when you talk about the physical piece, this is when I heard the meditation this morning, I heard it said that what we need to do is be aware of our breathing. We need to be able to center ourselves. And those are all part of this physical dimension. And again, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it, but it's not just who you are, it's the container of who you are. And I also like on the bottom here of the slide, I don't know if you can see it, it says, it's by Rumi, but it says, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Isn't that beautiful? And the last one is the emotional piece. It's how we connected with the world. And when you look at emotions, I look at emotions as first a physical experience from which feelings evolve. That emotions are hardwired, and that we have conversations with ourselves about the emotions, and from that emanates the feelings that we have. And again, every system has rules about how these emotions can be expressed. When I was teaching sociology, it was really fun to take this mandala and talk about just the differences in societies about how these rules are often different based on gender around each dimension. What's okay for a person to say who's a male historically, what's okay for a person to say who's female, what does the context say? And when I find that in this world that there are lots of rules about feelings and emotions particularly. The picture you're seeing, by the way, is Brazelton's work on emotions called the Baby Theater. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it was called the Infant Baby Theater. And it was one of the first studies ever done on whether or not children have innate emotions. And they put these little faces up, and they would watch and measure the children's responses to each one of these items. And they found very clearly that there are at least 6 basic emotions in children very, very young. So I thought that was an amazing great thing too. This is just a quick graphic here that I wanted to show you because it talks about the idea that if you have 2 human beings, 2 unique human beings, Virginia used to talk about in family systems, especially when you're doing family maps, how did your parents meet? And she called it meetings and matings. And so I just made this little piece, just a quick, funny little thing. It starts with the sensual piece. You look and you see part of the individual, you go, he's cute, he's not cute, he's ugly, she's good, she's not good, they are, whatever pronoun you want to use. There's a sensual reaction. Then there's a physical reaction. Some part of ourself is triggered. And then from that, we begin to have conversations with ourselves when we say, maybe I should talk to that person or not, maybe I should reach out. And then what happens is we begin to find out that that person is kind of interesting. We say, maybe let's go have dinner, let's go have a drink. And that nutritional piece kicks in as a way of doing the social interactions. And then what happens is we think about what's normal in our context. What happens if I take this person home? What will people think? Will that be a good thing or not a good thing? And then, where can we go that maybe we can get to know each other better or differently? And then that kicks in the emotional piece and the juicy part that Virginia loved to talk about. And we begin to connect. And then we begin to think about what we're doing and our families and whether or not going to agree with us or not. But we also become aware that there's a spiritual piece, that there's an energy here that we're beginning to connect with, and it may or may not be pleasant, but it's something that we're going to explore. So when you look at human beings, these dimensions are always going on. And when we connect, you can use this model, by the way, if you're doing work with premarital studies where people are getting together, and as a couple, I take this whole list and I talk about what do they share in belief systems around each dimension. And it's very interesting conversation. One of the ideas is also to ask them what's okay to talk about. What's okay to talk about in this dimension? What's okay to talk about in this dimension? The other idea here is that, again, they're fluid, but Virginia always talked about the idea that if you're going to have a healthy relationship, people have to be able to connect with each other. They have to be able to let go and connect. They have to be able to, and this is a meshment. So if you look at the difference in most relationships, what happens is people connect. We'll go back here. It's not working, but that's okay. They connect and they let go. When you look at families that are meshed, this is what happens. One person starts to take over the other person, begins to try to control. That's what happens often in family systems. And allowing people to de-enmesh is often a very difficult process. But that's really what we're in the business of doing, is allowing people to be able to go back and stand on their own 2 feet and connect when they need to and let go. But you have to be able to let go. Which brings us quickly 2 seconds to the process of change. And if you look at this process of change, when you look at the process of change, remember that the foreign element comes in and it hits the one of the dimensions, and that creates chaos. Something has to change. So this is one of the things that you need to think about. When you talk about the mandala, understand that it's the very first part of the process of change. And the other last thing, this is a picture I took in China. I was taken to a glass museum and I was shown this beautiful glass work that's museum quality. But I went behind the building and I found this dump. And I found in this dump, all this is a huge pile of glass. These are the mistakes people made making that beautiful work. And what it reminded me of is, this is really how it is. That in order to grow, you have to be able to break glass. You have to be able to make mistakes. And that's the whole process that we go through. Well, here's some questions is, and you obviously, first of all, how do you care for your dimensions? I give people the homework assignment of walk around each dimension. How do you care for each dimension? Choose whatever question fits for you. What needs might you have around a particular dimension? What do you want to let go of that you no longer need around each dimension? Or what family, and I think probably for discussion purposes, the last one is probably the easiest and best question is, what family rule have you changed that you no longer fits for you? Does that make sense to you? Hello?
Yes, family rule.
Yeah.
So maybe everybody doesn't know what a family rule is. So in a nutshell, do you want to tell us what that is?
Okay, well, let me ask you, I would answer by saying, are there any rules about your physical dimension? Don't shut yourself down there. Don't do this. How should you dress? Physical dimensions are the rules around in a family is about how people what's appropriate physically. Spiritual questions. Is it about religion? Is it about people deciding that they don't want to be part of that anymore, or they want to evolve, or they want to change? Every family has rules about this. Nutritionally, I can think about 100 of them at family dinners. People say, eat all your food. Don't talk at the dinner table. Don't whistle. Don't hit your brother. Whatever they may be. Sensual dimensions. What's okay for you to see? What's not okay for you to see? What's okay for you to touch? What's not okay for you to touch? Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect. Okay.
And interactional is probably the most. Is there's so many rules in family systems about what's okay to talk about, what's not. So.
Okay, great. So we'll give you guys, what do you think, Jen? 20, 25 minutes?
Let's do 25. There's just so much rich areas.
Okay. And I just leave this up because one of the reasons is because at the bottom of the iceberg, if you look at the iceberg, is the mandala. And we have yearnings around every dimension. We have expectations for every dimension. We have perceptions of every dimension. We have feelings about every dimension. And on top of that, it's how we behave. So the other question you might have is, what yearnings do you have for any of these dimensions? What dimension is most interesting to you that you might want to choose to work on for yourself in the future?